Everything you need to run or play Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition is free. The basic rules, which give you 4 races, 4 classes, 20 levels for each of those classes, and a good set of guidelines for DMing. They're available to download for free on Wizards of the Coast website and have been since 2018. How much money have I spent on this free edition of Dungeons & Dragons? It's hard to say, but I estimate somewhere around $2,000 US since 5e first hit the shelves. The rulebooks, spell decks, adventures, and D&D Beyond content. I'm not even going to get started on dice and minis. But how much of that has actually helped me run a better game? The answer sucks. It's definitely less than half. Maybe less than a quarter. With ADHD, the impulse to pour money into our hyperfixations is always brimming just below the surface, at least for me. And D&D has been a hyperfixation of mine for a very long time. The idea of having a custom miniature, cosplay, weapon props, and commissioned art, and theme songs for each of my characters really stimulates that part of me. And that's just as a player. As a dungeon master, it can get way out of hand, with companies like Dwarven Forge making beautiful products and a plethora of Etsy shops who can make or 3D print any single prop that I can imagine. Millions of stunning artists taking commissions. Writers and voice actors who can help bring what I imagine into reality. It's addicting. It's like being a god. One could easily spend $1,000 before a campaign even starts. And anyone who's been playing D&D for a few months or more knows that most campaigns don't get very far, certainly not finishing. And those that do, it's not because of how much money the Dungeon Master spent. Spending money, just like spending time world building, can reduce fear to a point. But how much money do we really need to spend on the game? Recently I interviewed Mike Shea, who's one of my tabletop role-playing game heroes, author of the Lazy Dungeon Master series and the writer at slyflourish.com. I asked him this question because getting the most bang for your buck and the most yield for your work is his bread and butter. Mike did not mention it, but I will. His latest Kickstarter, The Lazy Dungeon Master's Companion, is in its final week. I'm not being paid to mention it. It's a product I believe in, and Mike's books and articles have made me a better dungeon master. Faster than anything Wizards of the Coast has ever put out, so I'll link it in the description. Without further ado, Mr. Lazy Dungeon Master himself answers, when should we spend money on Dungeons & Dragons?
There's a lot of inertia in the world, and you can get really far if you can just skim off of a little bit of it, right? And yeah, so like how do you skim off of the inertia that other people have already invested in? So I've thought and talked a lot about where we can invest money into the hobby that actually makes a big difference and matters. And I think that like a lot of things in like a lot of areas where you can spend money, there's eventually a point of diminishing returns. I mean, I think the obvious ones are like the core books. Really nice to have the core books handy. You know, like the monster manual will be the best investment you can get in monsters, and then every other monster book can be pretty valuable. Maybe your second monster book is really good too, but then as you get to 6, 7, and 8, and 9, and 10, you're not really hitting those as much, right? They cost the same, but I didn't get a chance to go open that book, right? It's sitting on the shelf and everything else. But meanwhile, I can reskin every monster in the monster manual and turn it into essentially an infinite number of monsters. So I'm pretty happy with that. We're almost getting there with 5th, right? Like we've got Volos and we've got Mordenkainen's and we've got Van Richten's Guide, which is kind of a monster book. And we've got, and then Fizzbands is coming out soon, right? So we'll have sort of 5 monster books ish that Wizards has published, but then you have Toma Beasts and Toma Beast 2 and Creature Codex from Kobold Press, and then a plethora of other monster books from other publishers that in many cases are really, really good, right? And produce monsters that are in some ways run way better than the ones that Wizards of the Coast puts out, Getting the core books is pretty solid. Getting, I think like the $20 you can spend on a Paizo flip mat is one of the best investments. Fantastic thing. And it's so flexible. Like the idea of the blank slate, the blank Paizo flip mat with a dry erase marker. You can draw any kind of map you want. You can draw, weird symbols. You can keep track of initiative. You can do your monster damage. So many different things you can do on this, and it'll last forever, right? It's this piece of laminated cardboard that can sit in your kit for 20 years. One of the other things about D&D is it's essentially unlimited in the amount of money you can spend on it. I argue, I have one of my favorite friends and unofficial rivals, Teo Sabadia, Alpha Stream on Twitter. We talk about miniatures. One of our many kind of points where we get in debates is miniatures. And I'm like, there's no good way for somebody to get started with miniatures, right? Like there's, it is a bottomless pit. Like you are going to just hurl money into this and get random miniatures coming out, and you're never going to have the ones you need for any given game. When he and I got like 1,000 miniatures was when they were 25 cents a piece. And now they're $2.50 a piece, right? And it's not an efficient way to get in there. So what do you do instead? Like, how else do you represent monsters, and what else can you do? And so trying to find a way where you can drop like that first $10 or $20 or $30 on like generic tokens that you can use for monsters. And it's like, those will pretty much represent everything. But there's this draw to like, well, yeah, I'll just get this one miniature for this one guy. And then like, oh, but I'm going to run this boss. I should get one for the boss. And it just, it's easy to get out of hand. There was one game session that really codified like how money doesn't matter towards the fun of a game for the most part. And it was a game that I ran it was one of the sessions of Ghosts of Saltmarsh. It was an adventure called Isle of the Abbey. And I built out the entire Isle of the Abbey in Dwarven Forge, which is like 3D tabletop terrain, right? Pretty expensive stuff, pretty high end. It's one of those areas where it's a bottomless pit if you get involved in it. 3D, layered terrain and crazy, crazy stuff. It looks really good on Instagram, right? Like it's if you ever want to inject FOMO into other people, setting up a good Dwarven Forge setup and then putting it up on social media is a great way to throw some FOMO out there. And so I built out this whole Dwarven Forge setup for this thing with all the miniatures. And I remember one of my friends couldn't make it to the game. So I staged a photo of 3 of my other friends looking at it with like this expression of glee on their face. Like, like this is the best D&D game ever, right? And that was before the game began. And then we ran it and they hated it, right? It was like probably one of the worst sessions of D&D I'd ever run, because it was just this slog of traps and specters and life draining and not knowing why they're here and going into a room and another big ass fight that they didn't really feel like fighting, and at the end they're like, yeah, not great, right? I was like, but look at the Dwarven Forge, right? And so that really kind of clarified. And I also have sort of like this unofficial survey that I do with my wife. My wife plays in my Wednesday game, and after a game is done, I'll be like, on a scale of 1 to 10, how good was that game? And she'll give me a number, and I'll keep track of like which ones did I throw a lot of like miniatures and terrain into, hundreds of dollars worth of miniatures and terrain, and which ones did I run completely theater of the mind, and what's the difference in those scores. And both of us, talking about a long time, came to the conclusion that having a setup like that at best is giving you a 10% improvement in your game, right? Like it'll take a 7 to an 8 sometimes. But I ran one the other day where she said it was like a 7, and I said, how would it have been if it was just theater of the mind? And she said an 8. And I'm like, an 8? And she's like, yeah, it's real hard to see over the walls and stuff. And I'm like, oh my God, like it got worse. Like, it's a good example that like by far the best, I really think the best things you can do to make your D&D game better are free, right? That there isn't an amount of money you need to spend to get your game better. There are things you can buy. There's some great tools. I mean, 3x5 cards, right? They're like 5 cents a piece. Every DM's got at least one sitting within hand's reach. And, they're not even 5 cents a piece, a couple cents a piece. But boy, the flexibility of what you can do with these, like the number of different things you can do with the 3x5 card is amazing. And you're never going to get value like that out of a lot of other tools. So yeah, I think the from a lazy DM philosophical perspective, really looking at something you're going to buy and saying, how does this help me improvise my game? How is this thing I'm getting going to improve my flexibility in the kinds of stories that I can help facilitate at our table, right? Which is slightly more narrow than saying like, is it going to make my D&D game better? It's like, well, some people will think that, having a good collection of miniatures will, but then you talk to people like Merrick Blackman and they're like, look, my collection is paralyzing. I have too many and I can never find the ones I want. And it takes me 2 hours to get the minis for one session. I'd rather just do Theater of the Mind. Yeah, I became enamored with Theater of the Mind after 4th edition. Right, like 4th edition D&D, you couldn't play Theater of the Mind. There wasn't really a good way to do it. Some argue with me about it, and I just shake my head like, how do you do a slide 5 in Theater of the Mind, and or an area? How many guys are in my area burst 10? So when D&D Next came out was the first time I'd really seen Theater of the Mind and really played Theater of the Mind, because I didn't really get into D&D until like the 3rd. I mean, I guess we did Theater of the Mind when I was playing 2nd, but I don't really remember, right? I barely knew what I was doing anyway. But 3rd edition, we definitely played with miniatures and maps, and 4th was built that way. And then with Fifth and with D&D Next was the first real time I saw it. And just the idea that like we could tell all kinds of crazy stories that we couldn't tell on a flat map. That like, you know, I've got an airship that's crashing and people are falling through the air and gnolls are riding on floating discs trying to shoot you with arrows and you're dancing from disc to disc. It's like, how do you do that? Right? Like, you know, all kinds of like nutty situations that, you know, I think are just, you know, much like the flexibility of being able to say like, I have an unlimited budget when I'm running Theater of the Mind, right? I can anything we can, you know, imagine and share. We can do in Theater of the Mind, and it's not without its problems too. It's not without accessibility problems, right? There's I forget the name of it, but there's Aventasia, right, where you cannot, you know, I cannot see in my head a situation that's going on here, and that's where you're like, okay, let me jot down some stuff on a 3x5 card so you have some general orientation of who's where, right? And there's ways I think to handle that without immediately jumping to, well, I need a 5-foot grid. Yeah, and I love systems that have abstract combat in them, because they sort of have handled that to some degree. 13th Age with its, you know, abstract distances of adjacent, close, near, far. Numenera has the same thing. Fate has zones. I really like zone-based combat, and a lot of these you can kind of bring into your D&D game and sort of apply it. And the neat thing about those is, in those cases, you can still play with tabletop minis and terrain. You just don't have to count squares. And, you know, I'm perfectly happy not counting squares anymore. You know?
Thank you, Mike Shea, for your time and conversation. I've got more videos with him coming up. Subscribe if you don't want to miss those. If you liked what he had to say, I implore you to check out his Kickstarter in the description. If you want to hear the rest of that interview right now, I've got it uploaded to Patreon. Lowest tier is $2, and you get access to interviews like that as soon as I record them. Thank you, Cory, my latest patron. You are the best bean. And thanks to everyone whose continued support has helped me make time for interviews like this one. If you want to hang out with me, you can pop over to my Twitch channel, link in the description. And this month I'm exercising every time I die in Castlevania.
Jump over the fireballs.
It's been so much fun and so much punishment. Finally, thank you for watching. Until next time.